Yosef Kawadawi, the spiritual head of the Muslim Brotherhood, always taught throughout his life that the true believer, the true Muslim, according to this twisted view, is obligated to complete the work of Hitler. This is the Brotherhood. And 50 years ago, they set out on a strategic goal to move Israel away from the United States, to isolate it, to weaken it, to destroy it. This is the little Satan. And to murder Jews around the world. And they were going to use anti-Semitism to fragment and weaken the United States of America, to destroy the great Satan. So this is their strategic goal 50 years ago.
Over the last few years, we've watched anti-Semitism explode across universities, politics, social media, and now increasingly on the streets of cities like New York. What once lived on the fringes is now entering mainstream discourse, from Ivy League campuses to influencer culture to political movements to protests outside synagogues and Jewish neighborhoods. According to today's guest, this didn't happen by accident. He argues that billions of dollars from regimes like Qatar and Iran helped reshape Western institutions through soft power, ideological influence, and organized activist networks, creating an environment where anti-Semitism could become normalized under the language of activism and social justice. Dr. Charles Usher Small is the founder of ISGAP, one of the world's leading organizations studying global anti-Semitism, radical ideology, foreign influence operations, and the collapse of democratic values in the West. Today, we're talking about what happened after October 7th, the rise of anti-Semitism in the West, Qatar's influence on universities and media, the radicalization of parts of the right and left, and whether the West is finally waking up to what's happening. Dr. Small, welcome to our show.
I'm honored to be here with you, Daniel. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. In your opinion, did October 7th expose anti-Semitism, or did it simply give people permission to openly say what they already believed?
It's a great question. So, yeah, we saw the pogrom of October the 7th. And I think I'm going to preface what I'm going to say to, to the fact that the Jewish people historically were a people of the book, we're a people of knowledge, we're a people that champion study. And although the subject matter and the times that we live in are challenging, sometimes people are getting overwhelmed and even depressed by it all. I think we have to remember that when the Jewish people focuses on something and puts our energy into something, nothing will stop us. And you can look at our history, from Purim to Hanukkah and all. We can go on and on from a Jewish perspective, how we've triumphed over incredible odds. The establishment of Israel and its emergence as a vibrant superpower in the region that's, has brought Jews together from all different backgrounds, all parts of the world, to create this incredible, vibrant society of technology and food and culture and music and energy and, democracy. We could also look at, after the pogrom of October the 7th that caught the Jewish people and Israel off guard, that what Israel has accomplished in the kinetic warfare in the last 3 years is really, it's beyond astounding. And I think the fact that the Israeli military, obviously for many years before October the 7th, put so much energy and creativity and thought and intelligence and technology into what has been carried out in the last 3 years, shows that when we put our minds to something, when we invest energy and time into something, nobody and nothing will stop us. So I think we have to preface this, because I don't want people to be disparaging and despaired and depressed. This, in crises, there's opportunity. And I think this is an opportunity for the Jewish people to forge a strong identity. Maybe in the last several decades, we've been asleep at the wheel. We've been assimilating, losing track, especially in the United States, of who we are. And maybe now is a time that it's a wake-up call. Crisis brings opportunity, and maybe this is the opportunity. So I think that's really important, because the situation is serious, but I know that we will be successful if we focus. So yes, so your question, October the 7th caught us off guard. And in a way, I'm reminded of the words of Martin Luther King shortly before he was assassinated. He was speaking to the American public about how the Americans were sleeping through a revolution. And what he meant was, the established institutions in American society, universities, government, education institutions, universities, K through 12 to higher education, were segregated. And he said America was sleeping through a revolution because through cultural institutions, through music, through sports, through youth organizations, young people were coming together, and the walls of segregation were coming down. But the elite of societies were still asleep at this coming revolution. So he spoke about sleeping through a revolution. And I think that we in the West, the Jewish community, but also our government, our security, our education, we were sleeping through a revolution. And what I mean is that Hamas attacked Israel. Hamas is the Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think we need to understand the minds of our enemies because our enemies understand us. The Muslim Brotherhood was established about 100 years ago in Egypt. It's a fusion of what I would argue is a perversion of the great religion of Islam, a very narrow, reactionary, kind of repugnant view of Islam, fused with European genocidal anti-Semitism. They take the protocols of the elders of Zion, the words and ideas that led to the Holocaust, and fuses it with this perversion of Islam. So European anti-Semitism is a core element. It's the raison d'etre of the Brotherhood. It's not the military wing or the extremist wing. It's the core element of who the Brotherhood is. For example, Yosef Qaradawi, the spiritual head of the Muslim Brotherhood, always taught throughout his life that the true believer, the true Muslim, according to this twisted view, is obligated to complete the work of Hitler. This is the Brotherhood. And 50 years ago, they set out on a strategic goal to move Israel away from the United States, to isolate it, to weaken it, to destroy it. This is the little Satan. And to murder Jews around the world. And they were going to use anti-Semitism. I think this is very important for the American, establishment in our community here. They were going to use anti-Semitism to fragment and weaken the United States of America, to destroy the great Satan. So this is their strategic goal 50 years ago. And we as a community, we as a learned people who understand that knowledge and study is so important, most to this day, it's changing, but to this day, the vast majority of Jewish people in the United States and around the world never really heard of the Muslim Brotherhood, don't really know what the ideology is. So we need to study the minds of our enemy to defeat it. We need to know our enemy's strategic goals so that we can create strategies to deal with the threat. And, I think our community has been dealing with symptoms here and there, but not the threat. So as a people that prides ourselves on learning, we need to understand the language, the culture, the cosmology, the religion, the philosophy, the ideology, and the strategic goals of the Brotherhood. And I think this is incumbent on Jewish leaders to really understand what's hitting us and why.
Why were students at elite Western universities celebrating Hamas literally the day after October 7th? What does that say about Western education?
So that's a great question. So Yosef Qaradawi, who I just mentioned, preached his entire life, the spiritual head of the Brotherhood, that the true believer is obligated to complete the work of Hitler. In other words, murder Jews around the world, complete genocide. This character was invited by the British establishment to create Islamic studies in my alma mater at Oxford University. So one of the most important Islamic studies department at one of the best universities in the Western world, started by Yosef Qaradawi, started and funded by the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is staggering if you think about it. How can the British establishment welcome into a liberal education institution where young people, future citizens, or the people who learn how to be citizens, future leaders, are being inculcated by the Muslim Brotherhood that wants to not only exterminate Jews and destroy Israel, but they want to destroy democracy. They want to destroy the very essence of what a liberal critical education is all about, which is the foundation of our democracies. Incredible. So how does this happen? Yosef Qaradawi received exile from Egypt in Qatar. Qatar, the royal family of Qatar, has a bayah. In Hebrew, a bayah, we know, is a problem. In Islam, a bayah, interestingly enough, it means a spiritual oath. The royal family of Qatar has a spiritual oath to the Muslim Brotherhoods. They follow all of the religious edicts, rulings, and fatwas of the Brotherhood. So imagine Qatar is a small country. It only has 350,000 citizens. It's a tiny country. It has about 3 million inhabitants. But it's a small group of citizens, and it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So they take from their rabbis the rulings, the fatwas, and they're promoting, using soft power, the ideology of this anti-democratic, sexist, homophobic, genocidal, anti-Semitic social movement. So when Qatar funds Oxford University, or what we found in the research at ISGAP, we have an incredible research team. We've established that over $100 billion in undocumented money has come from Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood into higher education for 50 years. For 50 years, our liberal educational institutions, which I think liberal education in the United States and in democracies is kind of a sacred responsibility because they're teaching our future. This is the future. And radical social movements, be it the extreme left or the extreme right, know if you can impact the curriculum, impact the worldview of a higher education, you impact the future generations and you change the society from within. And this was the strategic goal of the Brotherhood. And I have to say, they were ingenious how they envisioned their strategic goal, and they've been ingenious in the way they're carrying it out. So infiltration in our best universities in the West has been going on for decades, and we know it. We know, for example, that Edward Said and Joseph Mossad and Rashid Khalili and all these extreme anti-Semitic characters were at Columbia University. They were in Middle East studies at UPenn, at Georgetown. We knew about it. But because we didn't understand the strategic goals of what was at stake, we thought, okay, this is our liberalism. We, in our faculty or in our classroom, we have different views, and this is what a liberal education is. But we didn't understand that this was a movement that was committed to demonizing Israel and destroying Israel at an intellectual, ideological movement as a precursor to destroying our democratic principles. So this has been going on for decades, and it's not surprising that the pogrom of October the 7th happened. And on October the 8th, October the 9th, when people came back to their campuses, they were met with faculty and student organizations, some of which have direct connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, espousing genocidal ideas on their campus. But this was in the works for many years, and I think now we're just beginning to understand the magnitude of this operation, if you will, this ideological and political operation that's taking place within our country.
You mentioned that this was decades in the making. Why do you think the West underestimated this ideological warfare? Is it because we only think in military terms, or it was something that we just overlooked?
Yeah, I think, especially in the United States, I think too little attention is placed on the notion or the importance of ideology. Ideology is really important. And even I think as scholars, the education system in American universities, I think traditionally have played too little attention on the power of ideology. I think it's a bit different in Western European universities. There's more attention to that, but less so in the United States. I think we didn't really understand the threat. And I often talk about this notion when Edward Said said in 1983 at Columbia University, he said that he was the last remaining Jewish intellectual. Said, I'm sure many of the viewers know him. He was a very important Palestinian intellectual at Columbia University, a professor of literary criticism, for the record. But he was although he was a literary critic, emerged as kind of one of the founding or more a very important intellectual in postmodern thought and post-colonial studies. And he famously said that he was the last Jewish intellectual, meaning that he was the inheritor to the Frankfurt School of Thought. The Frankfurt School of Thought is a very important philosophical movement that was created mainly by Jewish refugees from the Holocaust who made it to the United States, people like Horkheimer and Adorno. Hannah Arendt was involved and other sort of leading figures. And these were Jewish intellectuals, refugees from the Holocaust, from Germany mostly, who started writing about authoritarianism and the Holocaust and anti-Semitism really for the first time. And they were important, I won't go into all the details, more at a conceptual level as well. So Said said that the Jewish intellectuals in America became fat scribes in the suburbs. He was the last Jewish intellectual, and that the Palestinians were the Jews, and the Israelis and the Jews were the Nazis. And when he said this in 1983, people thought he's detached from reality, he had a bad day. It was, incomprehensible. Today, this is the discourse at most of our finest universities in the United States of America. And this is the extraordinary Holocaust inversion that's normalized in our education system. So if you think about it for a moment, the best intellectuals in Central Europe in the 1800s and early 1900s were teaching racialized theories that the world was divided into races where the white people were supreme and the black people were at the bottom of this hierarchy. And that the Jews somehow were not white, and we were poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. So professors of theology and biology and eugenics and the social sciences, these ideas that were percolating at the best universities filtered into society. And for all sorts of reasons, which I won't bore you with, these ideas gained traction, and these ideas led to the final solution. Racializing Jews as non-white, as poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. And 2 generations later, these intellectual clowns, I call them, they're really clowns. They know nothing about Jewish thought. They know nothing about our culture and our heritage, or pay little attention to our connection to our land, our indigenous land. And they now define the Jews as white. And it's not welcome to the club. We're so terribly sorry for what happened to you. In less than 2 generations, the Jews have become from non-white, we've become white, and we've become the epitome of white supremacy, of apartheid, and of racism. And this is not just the campus politics. This is what these clowns are now teaching at our finest universities. So if the Jews are white supremacists, colonizers, occupiers, apartheid supporters, and we're occupying the land, then from a liberal human rights perspective, you have to dismantle this apartheid state. And of course, the radical Muslims, the Muslim Brotherhood, backed by the Qataris, they're also pushing for this because the Islamists can't accept the Jew for being equal, can't accept the self-determination on land where Jews and Muslims, where men and women are equal. And the Jewish state, Israel, is the only place in which non-Muslims have self-determination. So the radical Muslims want to obliterate Israel. And these clowns, these sort of postmodern progressive clowns who want to end the occupation, who want to end Western and American hegemony in places that were once colonized, come together. So you have the extreme left and the extreme Islamists working together at the intellectual, political, and ideological space. And the intoxication of these ideas are so deep. You have people like Judith Butler, a woman, a Jewish woman, a queer Jewish woman with a career. She's a professor of philosophy in Berkeley. She argues that Hezbollah and Hamas ought to be perceived as part of the progressive left because they want to end the occupation. So could you imagine if Judith Butler and I were walking down the street in Tehran or in Gaza, I'd probably get 1 bullet in the head because I'm a Jewish Zionist. She'd get 3 or 4 bullets because she's a Jewish woman. She goes out of her home unaccompanied by a male member of her family. She has a career. She's queer. She's a feminist. She'd probably get 3 or 4 bullets. And yet the intoxication and the miseducation of people is so extreme that they will support Hamas. They will support the pogrom as a legitimate vehicle to end the occupation. And this is what's passing as education in our best universities, funded by the Muslim Brotherhood, soft power, kind of mixing with the sort of anti-colonial, so-called intellectualism that has now permeated our discourse. So it's a dangerous moment right
now. New York used to feel like the safest city in the world for Jews. We're now seeing protests outside synagogues, Jewish neighborhoods, Israeli restaurants, Jewish events, very recent news. At what point does this stop being anti-Israel activism and become intimidation of Jews? And what does the new mayor, have to play into that as well?
So, the distinction that some liberal Americans, if I may say, made between the anti-Israeli politics that has been going on in the region for many years and saying, in America, we're different. If the Israelis and the Palestinians make peace and end it, all this anti-Semitism will stop. And then this anti-Semitism started to permeate from the Middle East into Europe, into France, into the United Kingdom, into Belgium, where things are really dire. But American liberal Jews said, okay, it's bad in the Middle East, it's bad in Europe, but it can never happen here. Somehow we're different. Somehow we're not connected to the rest of the world. We're special. And then it started happening in Canada. This wave of anti-Semitism happened north of the border to the point where Canadians are now discussing what they should do. Should they stay or should they go? And yet our leaders in the legacy organizations said, well, we're different. But what happened on October the 8th was brewing in the United States of America for decades. So we're not so different. So Mamdani, who's Mamdani? Mamdani was the son of a professor at Columbia University who's at the forefront of the discourse that I was just describing a moment ago. Kicked out of Uganda, went to South Africa, where he taught for a while. Then he comes to Columbia University, the father, brought in by Said and this sort of group of characters. So the son is a second generation, brilliant, young, charismatic guy, went to Bowdoin College, a very fine university in Maine, and established SJP there, Students for Justice in Palestine. Now, what's SJP? I remember the days where Jewish organizations, I won't mention names, were encouraging kids in top universities, go have a Shabbat with SJP. But SJP were rejectionists. They didn't want to have Shabbat with Jewish kids. They didn't want to negotiate with Israel or with Zionists. But this was the response from our legacy organizations for so many years. SJP comes out of an organization called AMP, American Muslims for Palestine, which is a Muslim Brotherhood entity. So you can see the ideology of SJP on our campuses, over 400 campuses in North America, where they're influenced directly in some cases and indirectly by the Muslim Brotherhood. And if you remember, days after the pogrom of October the 7th, the kids at SJP at the encampments of many universities had Hamas toolkits. They were saying they don't support the struggle of Hamas. They were saying we are Hamas. And Hamas is the Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood. So you have the infiltration into students from the classroom to the encampment of this Muslim Brotherhood ideology. So Mamdani starts SJP connected to the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, an ideology that wants to murder the Jews around the world, finish the work of Hitler, destroy Israel, and then use anti-Semitism to fragment and weaken the great Satan. So this kid who establishes SJP, charismatic, progressive, red-green alliance, which I've just been speaking to you about, and he's running for the mayor of New York. And it's a city of fragmentation, a city of poverty, a city where, some have a lot and many don't have much. These are difficult times. There's this crisis in our economy and in our political system. And he's preying on it, benefiting from this in his campaign, using savvy social media messages and appealing to young, disenfranchised people. And we estimate that at least 30% of the Jewish community voted for him because we're not educated. We don't understand the mind of our enemy. We don't understand what is at stake. And so he seems progressive. He seems hip. He's using social media. His mother's a very well-known filmmaker. His wife is an artist. He comes from this milieu, second generation, and he's impactful. So here you have this progressive anti-Zionist guy, like most progressives are anti-Zionist, and he's removing the IRA definition. He's transforming the policies of anti-Semitism. He's now on the verge of changing how the police physically respond to threats and protests. He wants to dismantle the unit that is protecting people during protests. And yeah, I think we're in a situation now where he's legitimizing the extremism of SJP and the radical groups in New York. He's really empowering them. He didn't quite, from the river to the sea was a slogan that he was promoting. The Hamas toolkit was a toolkit he promoted. And now, the progressive people are realizing, well, maybe this is not so progressive to allow the mobs to walk through a Jewish neighborhood. To allow mobs to walk through a Jewish neighborhood with if it was white hoods or kafirs or COVID masks, they're hooded, right? This is reminiscent of many, many decades ago. Change the kafir and a mask for a white hood, and the mayor is remaining silent. So he's, in my view, and I just wrote something on it, he's directly and most certainly indirectly advocating violence against Jews. When he went to Ken Griffin's home, this famous video that everybody's seen, Ken Griffin, not Jewish, but spoke out about the anti-Semitism in his alma mater in a very forceful way. So I suspect he was perceived as an enemy by the SJP crowd. So for the mayor of New York to go on a video and say, this is where the guy lives, months after the chairman or the CEO of the healthcare was murdered in the streets in that neighborhood, is remarkable. It's really remarkable, and I've never seen anything quite like this. The advocacy of violence indirectly and in some cases directly is alarming. Professor Elie Wiesel, who was the first president of ISGAP, always taught us that the Holocaust, I don't mean to be melodramatic, but I have to say it. It didn't begin with the railroad tracks and crematoriums. It began with words and ideas. And the words of ideas of SJP, of the Muslim Brotherhood, we really need to understand what is at stake and what is the strategic goals of these organizations and how it's being played out. So anti-Semitism begins with the Jews, as Elie Wiesel taught us, but it never ends with the Jews. This is an affront on our democratic principles. So Mamdani has a problem with the Jews, or he has a problem with Israel, but he's advocating violence in the United States of America, directly and indirectly. And this should be an affront. This is an affront to the rule of law, which is the cornerstone of our democracy. And it's alarming. And I think there may be some investigations now brewing into all of this, but yeah, this is really a threat, whether you're on the left, on the right, if you're progressive or conservative or secular or religious. This is an affront to the rule of law and to our democratic principles. And it's a threat not to the Jewish community only, it's a threat to the stability of our society.
This is one thing I was wondering about. Why are so many protests happening outside of these Jewish spaces, synagogues, for example, instead of a government building or embassies? And in any other war, that's where people would be protesting. And another thing is, people debate constantly whether these protests are truly grassroots or not. From your research, how organized are these movements actually? Where's the funding coming from for these protests?
Yeah, so again, we have to go back to this ideology. The social movement of the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots, American Muslims for Palestine, SJP, CARE, all these sort of this infrastructure that has been established in the United States of America over the decades, they don't distinguish between their anti-Semitism and their so-called anti-Zionism. Again, Yosef Kaudawi, preached the core element of the Brotherhood's ideology, where he argues that if you're a real believer, a real true Muslim, you're obligated to complete the work of Hitler. So now Americans are still saying, well, wait a minute, some of us like the Israeli policy, some of us don't. Some of us love Netanyahu, others don't. Why are you coming through our neighborhoods? Go to the Israeli consulate and protest. But this is not the strategic understanding and goals of the Muslim Brotherhood and this sort of red-green alliance. They're anti-Semitic. They hate Jews. And the astounding thing to me is, if we understand the mind of our enemies, if we take the time to understand our enemies, which is, basic. If you want to have a good strategy, you need to understand the enemy. They're clear. They're the class inequalities that exist in New York. They see the so-called special treatment of Israel. among the founding nations or within the American policy over the last several decades as a problem. It's there, yeah, the anti-Semitism runs really deep in this sort of worldview. So I think we need to understand that the distinctions that we want to make in the United States, or what we want to make in terms of what's anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic, and what's legitimate criticism of Israel, or what where the red line is between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, let's say, what we perceive is not what they perceive. We need to understand who these characters are and what their goals are, and they're clear. So yes, I think we are in a moment now where if you read the ideology of Mamdani, if you see what he's doing in terms of his Israeli policy, what he advocates is dangerous. Look, and I think what he's doing with the city government needs to be understood by leaders in the Jewish community and leaders in the United States of America and in the security forces, because I think these guys, their agenda is quite clear, and I'm quite concerned that things are going to kind of evolve in the next several months in a way that it's going to make many people uncomfortable in New York.
Now, you've described social media as a super spreader of anti Semitism. Is the internet now radicalizing people faster than universities?
Absolutely. This is not my area of expertise, so I'm speaking slightly ignorant, but some of my colleagues who work at ISGAP, one person who comes to mind, Harris Rafiq, who's the vice president of policy at ISGAP, he was the head of the Quilliam Foundation, which was a very important research center based in the United Kingdom, but they did have some work, an office here in the United States. They were Muslim intellectuals fighting extremism and radicalization. And when they started the process of sort of understanding and developing models to thwart radicalization of young people, they would come across cases back in the day where it would take 80 or 90 days to radicalize somebody. You have to teach them and draw them in. It's a whole process. Now they're finding, this was before the explosion of social media. Now they're finding in social media that people could be radicalized in days and made to act in a violent way within days. So it's frightening. So these are extreme cases, but you can see how the discourse connected to social media is really, it changes rapidly and it's having impact. You can look at these clowns, Tucker Carlson and other people, and they become very popular out of nowhere, and they have influence, they have impact especially among young people who get a lot of their information from social media. Now I'm going to date myself, but when I was a student in the UK, I remember I used to, when I was living in a hall of residence, we would everybody would get together at 9 o'clock to watch the BBC News. And it was a 30-minute news broadcast. And there were about 3 or 4 stories from around the world. And the journalists would go out for weeks and they would create sort of mini documentaries for 3 to 8 minutes on a subject matter. They would interview people, they would give context, they would have experts, and they would present it in a way that my classmates and I would go off into the pub and debate and discuss the issues of the day from different political perspectives. Today, there's no context. It's talking heads on the cable news, and there's information that's being pushed out in social media that's becoming increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to ascertain. Forget the context, but what is real? What is fake? And with software, spreading false news and information, it looks like leaders or people are saying things that they don't really say. It's very complicated, very difficult. So the level and speed of misinformation is quite terrifying. It's a big problem.
Yeah, AI is making it a lot worse because you can literally create anything nowadays and
Yeah.
you would think it's true. Why do you think that some major influencers are actually more and more of them are becoming obsessed with Israel and the Jews? You mentioned Tucker Carlson, but what explains the transformation of these people? Is it ideological, financial? They're following the algorithm, or is there something else over there?
So look, I would say, so as a scholar, there's serious studies on why anti-Semitism exists, especially in Western civilization, in Western thought. At ISGAP, we were involved in an amazing event where we helped to bring David Nuremberg to. We have a small research center at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. David Nuremberg is the head of the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, and he's a leading scholar in anti-Semitism. And he gave the Tanner Lecture at Cambridge at Clare Hall. You can go to YouTube and you can watch the lecture. I really urge everybody to watch it. So I think Nuremberg is a serious scholar of history and the history of ideas. And he shows how, in a nutshell, how Christianity and Islam had issues with Judaism and the Jewish perception of God and the Jewish notion of, or I guess, our connection to it, to the land of Israel and to Jerusalem. And he documents how in Christian thought and in Islamic thought there were issues when it comes to Jews in Israel, and how the criticism of Judaism and Israel also informs the ideas, the religious ideas informs Enlightenment thought and philosophy, and how these ideas are really deeply embedded in our culture, in our civilization. And he does it. It's worth watching the lecture if there's any intellectuals on the call. I urge you, and you can watch the lecture. And Nuremberg has written wonderful books, including a book on anti-Judaism, which if you're any scholars out there, you should read. So it goes deep into our culture and civilization. And then at a simpler level, maybe, you know, you have washed up journalists that were fired by the cable news, like Tucker Carlson and others, Candace Owen, and they're in this time of fragmentation and of uncertainty. I think people are losing their trust in institutions and political institutions and cultural institutions, fed by foreign funding to some extent as well. I think you have a situation where, you know, washed up journalists are going to the lowest, most disgusting common denominator to get clicks. And the more disgusting and extreme that they are, the more money and the more support and popularity they're getting. And it's a vicious circle. And there isn't the traditional news media, you know, that is presenting serious journalism that takes weeks to put together with analysis and contextualization and present it to the public. And you're having faster and faster information and news and misinformation flying around as truth. And there are people benefiting from it. And it's, you know, this moment makes George Orwell look kind of easy and tame compared to the challenges we face in our search for truth.
Yeah, it's interesting. You have these influencers that you have them on video saying one thing, and then a few months later they're saying completely the opposite. You wonder how a person can completely change their views. They're speaking against Sharia law and things like that, and then they start to praise it. It's very interesting when you see this. But now
Yeah.
you're seeing a woke right emerging that mirrors the anti-Semitism that we traditionally associate with the left, with the far left. Has there been any point in time in history where you've had both sides kind of against the Jews, against Israel?
Yeah, there has been times, definitely. So remember, even in the 1970s and 80s, there was sort of the rise of the skinhead movement and the Aryan nations, and there was like militia groups connected to the KKK. And at the time, they were, you know, connecting to radical leftist terrorist organizations and radical Islamist organizations. There was some talk in the early 80s of that sort of thing happening, but it was really on the extremes of society. It was really marginal groups. And what's fascinating about anti-Semitism, especially at this moment, I think there's an attack on the democratic center. I've written on this. We call this the crisis of modernity. And you have a situation, and you know, where in a way society is increasingly fragmented, institutions are weakened, states in some cases are failing, other states are weak. As states fails, you know, there's international migration crisis, which undermine rather the institutions and the standing of citizens in many Western democratic countries. So that's really we're in a moment of flux globally, and in this time of uncertainty, you know, extremism grows. And what's unique about anti-Semitism and the depth of it in our, I think, in Christian, sort of Western civilization and Christianity, and also in Islam, is there's this deep-seated mistrust of Jews and Judaism that goes back many centuries. And what emerges is that you have radical political Islam that's anti-Semitic, that takes from you know, takes its genocidal anti-Semitism and even Nazism as a core element of its ideology. So you have radical Islam influenced by European anti-Semitism and even fascism and Nazism. And then the radical left, which is diametrically opposed to religion, etc. But the radical left wants to get rid of Western hegemony, which uses anti-Semitism to define Zionism and the Jews as a core element of the capitalist system and of colonialism. So you have the radical left, the radical right, and radical Islam, social movements that at one level have nothing really in common, except for the fact that they're attacking the democratic center, and they use anti-Semitism as a core element of their ideology. And this has been going, as we know, in different guises for generations, and it's reemerging.
In 1979 in Iran, you had the uniting between the radical Islamists with the far left, and I believe once Khomeini got into power, the first people that they got rid of was the left. So, do you see kind of history repeating itself in that they just use the far left for their own needs until they don't need them anymore?
Yeah, yeah, it's a very important point. And as you said this, the Red Green Alliance and of Iran, it's fascinating. So first of all, the Iranian revolutionary regime Shiite, right, at war with the Sunnis. The Muslim Brotherhood starts in Egypt 100 years ago, a Sunni entity, but the Shiite radical Islamists of the Iranian revolutionary regime is influenced by the intellectuals and the ideological formation of the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood, and they pay homage and respect to the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood, even though they're Shiite and they're at war with the Sunnis. So the Iranian revolutionary regime informed by the Brotherhood ideology. Number one. Number two, these characters of Edward Said and Michel Foucault, the progressive, postmodern, post-colonial so-called left, I don't even think they're left, but so be it, they were supportive of the Iranian Revolution. They wrote how the Iranian Revolution would become akin to what the French Revolution was to the West and to democracy. The Iranian Revolutionary would be to the Islamic world. So Said overlooks the anti-Semitism, the inherent connections to fascism and Nazism and the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the cleavages in the Middle East for his political expediency and to sort of rationalize his ideology. And this legacy of post-colonial studies and post-modernity in the Western Academy is these red-green alliances go deep intellectually, philosophically, and politically, and it's reemerging today in a very powerful way. And yes, I think what you said is absolutely true. Ultimately, a radical Puritan Islamist, you know, if you look at the crew of characters that went into, goes to the flotilla on the way to Gaza from Spain and from Europe, this hodgepodge of, progressive, queer, anarchistic, leftist, could you imagine them living in Iran or in Gaza? They wouldn't last for 2 minutes. So after this Islamist revolution, you're right, this motley crew of the postmodern leftists, they'd be first on the chopping block, as they say. Crazy.
Yeah. Now, we know that there are some Arab countries that have banned the Muslim Brotherhood, but it seems like they're flourishing in the West. And it seems to me that they take our democracies and use it to their benefit. Is that a correct assessment? And is there anything that could be done in the West towards the Muslim Brotherhood in that, they have many different organizations like you mentioned, and they can always open up new organizations as a cover. Is there anything that could be done to the Muslim Brotherhood in a democracy in the West?
So you raise a very important point, and I'd say a positive point. So I started at the beginning where I said if the Jewish people focus on the problem and we learn and we study, we'll come up with solutions. And there's nothing we can't do. So we're discussing a very difficult challenge, but I think if we focus, we'll find creative ways to come up with solutions. And another area of hope is what you've just touched on. So the Middle East, which knows the Muslim Brotherhood better than anybody, who's experienced and lived with them, they understand the danger of the Muslim Brotherhood. They understand how the Brotherhood can destroy communities, can destroy mosques. I grew up in Montreal, and our neighbors were a Muslim family originally from India, a wonderful family. And the father, our neighbor, started a mosque in Montreal. He was clean shaven. He had many Jewish friends, a mensch, a nice guy. And eventually, members of the mosque told him, you have to grow a beard. You can't stay here if you don't shave. And if you stay, you can't be friends with Jews. So he left. So this radical ideology destroys communities, destroys mosques, destroys societies. And the damage done by the Muslim Brotherhood is primarily to Muslims. Over 90% of the victims of the Brotherhood are Muslims. So the Middle East knows the danger and the violence of the Brotherhood. So you have countries like the UAE and Bahrain and Jordan and other countries that are banning the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're warning the West. This problem that was really local is now, as you said, migrating to the West. So as the Middle East, clamps down on this violent ideology, many people are moving into Western Europe and into North America. So the extremists are going to the point where the UAE they're not giving scholarships anymore to UAE students who want to go to Britain. I studied in England in the 1980s and 90s. And if you got a British education, it was one of the best sort of liberal Western educations you can get. And now it's a place where young people are being radicalized in the most pernicious way. And it's dangerous. So you're right. The radicals are moving into the West and they're posing a threat to us here. And we need to learn from our allies in the Middle East of the dangers, who they are, what the threat is, how they operate, how they infiltrate. And we have to put an end to it. And I'm happy to say that at ISGAP, we did a major report in November on the entryism of the Muslim Brotherhood into the United States. And our report helped to pave the way for the President Trump and the administration to actually sign an executive order designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a terror organization. So we're beginning to get some traction. And I hope that the United States, in a way, I think among Western democratic countries, is perhaps among the last man standing, and we need to be strong in the United States and support our allies, our Western democratic allies in Canada and Europe, to really weed out and expose this anti-democratic threat to democracy. And it begins with the Jews. Jews are being attacked in the streets of Toronto and on the streets of London and Brussels. But we're also being attacked intellectually and ideologically in the best institutions of higher education in the West. We need to, as they're being rooted out in the Middle East, like by the UAE and other wonderful countries, our allies, we have to do it here.
How serious is the situation in Europe right now? Especially in places like the UK, you mentioned it's getting physical. There's stabbings, there's terrorist attacks. People say that the United States is about 10 to 15 years behind Europe. So whatever happens there eventually happens here. What do you, and I mean, where does Canada fit into this? And is there anything that could be done? Meaning, what I guess the way they're dealing with there is just to kind of beef up the security in the Jewish neighborhoods. But what is your assessment of that?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely correct that this sort of wave of anti-Semitism, which is the symptom or the precursor to the more, I'd say, more in-depth threat or more fundamental threat of radicalization. It started in Europe, decades before it arrived here. And yes, I think it goes from Western Europe or from Europe into the UK, from the UK into Canada, and certainly into the United States. There's no society, no man is an island. We're all interconnected, especially in this globalized moment where information and ideas and people are traveling and moving very quickly. So it is definitely coming here. It's here. I would argue that it's here. Maybe not as developed as Canada and in the UK or in Europe, but it's coming here. And you stop it rather by understanding the ideological threat, understanding how Qatar and other entities, financial entities, are moving billions and trillions of dollars into our universities, into our cultural institutions, into our law firms and advertising agencies. You even have, into our investment banks and institutions. You even have entities fighting anti-Semitism that are in bed with, investing in places where ultimately are out to destroy not only the Jewish people, but democracy. So we really need to understand how the enemy works and stop it financially and ideologically. And I think if there's a will, we can achieve success. But we have to understand the threat, and then once we understand the threat deeply, develop strategies to combat it. But you're right. The violence in the streets of Europe, if we're going to respond to that, it's reactionary. We're reacting to save people's lives and to have physical security is essential, but it's a reaction to deeper things that are taking place. Money coming in, people coming in, institutions being bought. We have to stop the violence and then deal with the strategic threat in a more comprehensive manner.
You said something powerful before. You said that after October 7th, Israel sent a message to the world: if you attack Jews, there will be consequences, right? Do you think that Jewish strength changes how anti Semites behave?
Yeah, I think it does. I think some of the anti-Semitism, especially in Europe, I would argue, is related to Israel's success and to its power. So can you imagine in the kinetic war, what Israel has done in the last 3 years is extraordinary. I don't understand it. How you can do thousands of sorties in Iran and refuel, how you have intelligence on the ground and in the military and in the government. It's extraordinary. It's if somebody came with a movie script and described this a few years or 5 years ago, we'd say it's too far fetched. Nobody would believe it. And yet, Israel with the United States and other allies, as we now are slowly finding out, like the UAE and the Saudis and the Jordanians, really had an amazing alliance to attack the Iranian revolutionary regime. But I think when Israel could, demonstrate such power in the kinetic war, and you look to France and Britain, who are inept and impotent, I don't know what they can do. Their navies are depleted, their military is depleted, their citizenship, the political system. Can a government stand up strong to radical Islam, and will they lose too many members of parliament, too many votes? So domestically there's a threat. And the British and French people understand that they're at a crossroads where the future of their liberal democratic values and institutions seem to be really threatened by reactionary forces. And then they look to Israel, which is demonstrating so much power, and they're in the forefront of defending Western democratic values. I think this causes a little bit of kind of an anti-Semitism in the chatting classes among the elite, because they know that their societies are really threatened, and then they look to the Jews, and we're 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 kind of mixing it up in a way. So I think this is causing some anti-Semitism as well. So the weak Jew causes anti-Semitism, and the strong Jew causes anti-Semitism. But okay, the Jews are about. We have to protect our own society, and I think we have allies in the Middle East now that understand the threat of radical Islam, and thankfully, the American military and the United States are at the forefront of stopping this radical cult of death. Never mind its anti-democracy ideology, but it's this cult of death. It's a perversion of Islam, and thank God there are countries rising to defend it in the kinetic war. And I hope we could defend it politically and ideologically in the domestic environment as well.
I want to thank you for your time and for your insights. I definitely learned a lot in this conversation. If
Okay.
people want to get in touch or read what you write, or how could they find your organization, anything you'd want them to know?
So you're very welcome to go to our website, which is www.isgap.org. And we have a lot of material. We have lectures and seminars. We have a certificate training program. You can take courses with us in many languages. We have publications. We have, now, if you go to our publication page, there's a whole series after October 7th. We have about 25 reports on the infiltration of the Muslim Brotherhood into the West, into the United States and beyond, into our higher education, into our universities, and everything that we publish is available to the public free of charge.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. If you have a 401k or an IRA, please listen. Gold is at record highs. What many people don't know is this: You can move part of your retirement money legally and without tax penalties into physical gold you actually own. Alpha Omega Gold helps you do this through a gold IRA. Your gold is real. It is stored safely. It is in your name. Learn more at ao.gold/stand. Alpha Omega Gold is our sponsor, and they proudly stand with Israel.